Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Thanks, Chris. Good evening. Welcome to the show. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. More unbelievable bias from your ABC, with an interview last night descending into farce as Liberal Ted O'Brien was repeatedly shut down when discussing nuclear energy. Now, Labor refuses to have any debate on nuclear, so too now does the ABC. Is AUKUS dead in the water? Well, that's the worry, with news overnight that the Pentagon is halving the number of Virginia-class nuclear submarines. We'll speak to Greg Sheridan about what this means for Australia as our region becomes more precarious by the day. And we'll get the latest too on the formal nominations of both Presidents Biden and Trump, as all other candidates now fall away. To London, and a huge win for medical prudence. Britain's NHS officially banning puberty blockers for children. I'll get you the latest, but will it finally mean in Australia we'll get a proper expert inquiry into gender dysphoria? It's been rejected 3 times now by Labor. And it'll come as no surprise, but there's been yet another bungle in the foreign criminals disaster, with the Albanese government forced to reissue visas for 148 of the dangerous criminals. And still, the utterly incompetent minister remains in his job.
Minister Giles and others shouldn't be in their jobs. How the Prime Minister can keep Minister Giles in his job when he's released 149 hardcore criminals into the community on the wrong visas is beyond the average Australian's comprehension.
But first, the former head of the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, we know it as ANSTO, says that nuclear is, quote, the only rational choice for a post-coal dispatchable power.
Australia really needs to know that without nuclear, we are going to be the most expensive electricity destination in the world, and we're very unlikely to be competitive in any form of economy.
We can have these safe, always on, always available plants, keeping the price of electricity down at the lowest levels.
I think we're moving into a phase where they're talking about tripling the amount of nuclear in the world in the next 20 to 30 years.
He might be the country's top nuclear science expert, but that won't stop the national broadcaster trying to howl down anyone arguing that Australia must adopt nuclear power on land, and the sooner we do, the better. On the ABC's flagship current affairs program last night, 7:30 report host Sarah Ferguson didn't so much interview the Coalition's energy spokesman, Ted O'Brien, as she engaged in poisonous sniping. A few witnesses in a court case have been treated as roughly as O'Brien, with every answer interrupted by the so-called interviewer. Indeed, it wasn't so much a hostile cross-examination as a Soviet-style interrogation.
Stop you. I'm just going to. I know it's jumping in very quickly, but forgive me because
no, that's okay.
We've spoken to a lot of experts, and there's a lot of expertise on the table from the CSIRO over a number of years.
Right.
So let's.
So before construction, you're right. You do need to stand up a regulator and so forth.
I'm just going to ask you a question now.
Can I answer that question?
Let me just say this one thing, because I think this is very important for the audience.
Right now, we are in a mess because we have somebody with one-liners trying to run the system.
To be fair to him, he was talking about a whole series of things. That was the thing that
was specific. We already have blackouts. It's getting worse, and our renewables target is failing.
And we have this government to talk about nuclear energy. So let's not waste time talking about the government for the moment. No, I'm going to stop you there.
I mean, it was extraordinary. O'Brien was trying to make the reasonable point that Australia could go from decision to operational nuclear power within 3 to 5 years using small modular nuclear reactors, or within 6 to 12 years with a large nuclear plant, just like the one built in the Emirates. But Ferguson would have none of that. She kept insisting that what O'Brien was saying was impossible because Australia was coming off a standing start.
In a comparable economy is a lot more than the time frame that you're describing. In the United States, it's 19 years on average. So how does Australia, with no supporting laws, no regulations, no workforce, no experience, no waste plans, no social licence, do it in under 10 years?
Now, even though, as I said last night, in the Emirates, They've gone from letting contracts to a South Korean-led nuclear consortium in 2009, starting work in 2011, first generating power in 2020, to being fully operational today. Now, this is a 5,500 megawatt nuclear facility capable of supplying 25% of the oil-rich UAE's power. And that went from start to finish in under 15 years and cost $35 billion. Compare that with Malcolm Turnbull's Snowy project. Now, it's little more than a third of the UAE's nuclear plant's power capacity. That was a project originally costed at $2 billion. It's blown out now to at least $12 billion. It was meant to be operational 2 years ago in 2022, but we're not going to see it until 2029 now, or possibly later. Now, apart from rubbishing O'Brien's view that Australia should join the other 30-plus countries already with nuclear power, and mostly with lower power prices than Australia, Ferguson's main objective was to paint the coalition as pro-coal. Now, O'Brien pointed out that 90% of our current dispatchable power generation was coal. Yeah, that was all meant to be fully closed down within a decade, and that would mean, if it happens, the lights going out.
Our view is we should not be closing our coal-fired power stations prematurely. Now, the reason I say that is, as of today, we are looking at 90% of our baseload energy exiting the grid by 2034. So we're talking within a decade, 90% of our baseload energy gone because of Labor's policy settings. Now, Sarah, the lights will go out.
He said that Labor's real policy was to keep coal going via those secret deals we've discussed in Victoria, and the talks currently going on in New South Wales to keep Eraring open. But that didn't stop Ferguson trying to make out that it was the coalition and only the coalition that was pro-coal.
The question was, is it your policy to keep coal-fired power stations running longer? Are you saying
the lights will go out if that happens?
It is going to be coalition policy that you will keep those coal-fired power stations running longer than the dates that have been set in train now?
No, they're your words.
I mean, they're the decisions taken by the companies and the organisations that run those power stations.
We have a massive problem in this country, and it's not just the misinformation on the ABC, or that doesn't help. We need a rational debate about the big issues facing our nation, and one of those is 24/7 power. All modern economies need it to prosper and to maintain energy security. Yet the renewable power that we're supposed to depend on in just a few years' time only works when the wind blows and the sun shines. Firming or backup power supplies that can be turned on quickly when renewables fail, well, they require gas. The Greens and Labor now want to ban gas. Batteries, well, they're hugely expensive, highly polluting, and not grid scale. They might help power a home for a few hours, but they won't work for factories or cities. And green hydrogen, well, it's a boondoggle. It's nowhere near proven, let alone cost-effective. Yet the Green Left, including the ABC, are now mounting the mother of all scare campaigns to say that we must not do what 30-plus other countries are doing, and that we must not do on land whatever the Albanese government says we can do and must do on sea, and namely, that's to rely on nuclear power generation. After all, much of the uranium used overseas is Australian uranium mined here. Now, if we really do have to get to net zero, and the only way we can do that and keep the lights on is to go nuclear. So thank God Peter Dutton and his team and Ted O'Brien there look like they are up for the fight. This issue is not political, or at least it shouldn't be. It's about the national interest. And if the Prime Minister is so sure he's right, why then is he running scared from a debate with Dutton? And just when you thought that foreign criminals issue couldn't get any worse for the Albanese government, well, it has. First, the government released 149 foreign criminals out into the community when the High Court only ruled they had to release one. Just one. Second, the government was shamed into passing legislation to deal with this by the opposition when its initial inclination was to wash its hands of the 7 murderers and 37 sex offenders, amongst others. And third, despite having that legislation, the government hasn't actually applied to lock up any of these potentially dangerous criminals. Yet, in yet another hitch, it turns out that those being prosecuted for breaching their visa conditions will now all get off scot-free because of a problem with 2013 legislation passed under the Gillard government when Albanese was on the front bench, Tony Burke, Penny Wong, all of them, including this bloke Brendan O'Connor, who was then the minister in charge. Now, funny about that, because early this morning, the Labor spinners tried to blame this latest stuff-up on the coalition. The Abbott government, in fact. Now, I can assure you, you'd be hard-pressed to find any example of where Tony Abbott didn't do what was needed to protect Australians.
This is a technical issue that goes back to 2013.
The fact remains that this is an issue that had been on the books for more than a decade, since 2013, throughout, indeed, the former government's time. 2013
under Gillard, not 2013 under Abbott. As Peter Dutton said today on this issue, the government's lurching from disaster to disaster.
This issue was a technical issue and has now been resolved. And I want to reassure every member of the Australian community that this has not affected the constant supervision, the constant monitoring of everyone who was required to be released in this cohort.
And yet the Prime Minister is so weak, he keeps that clown in the job, and in doing so, puts all of us in the community at risk. All right, Trudy McIntosh now with the headlines out of Canberra.
It's the latest twist in the detainee drama. 149 criminals released into the community last year were issued the wrong visa.
This issue was a technical issue and has now been resolved.
The Immigration Minister only discovered the blunder last Sunday. The result, 10 freed detainees now likely won't face charges for breaching visa conditions, including curfews and electronic monitoring.
This is a government that goes from train wreck to train wreck.
This is a technical issue that goes back to 2013.
The Prime Minister spent a second day in the top end, taking his cabinet to Darwin, earlier announcing a $1 billion funding deal to address disadvantage in Northern Territory schools.
When one child gets left behind in this country, that is a drag on them and their life, but it also is a drag on our nation.
Friendly fire, though, from the New South Wales Premier over the GST carve-up. His state set to go backwards, while Victoria is the biggest winner.
Is this accidental or is it deliberate? Because I think the taxpayers of New South Wales need to understand why.
The Greens today offered to support Labor's vehicle emissions changes if the government ditches laws to fast-track offshore gas approvals.
All of the gains from the electric vehicle legislation would be wiped out if even one big new gas mine is approved.
Meanwhile, Australia's purchase of 3 US nuclear-powered submarines could be dealt a blow. The Pentagon has halved production of the Virginia-class submarine this year. It could have a flow-on impact for AUKUS.
And there will be difficulties from time to time, either at the US end or the Australian end or the UK end, but they will be ironed out.
There was better news overnight for Australian wine growers, China all but confirming it will lift tariffs of more than 200%.
We view this as very positive news for the Australian industry. It's the best news we've had in 4 years.
All right, a lot of other headlines there, and those as well. We'll get into them now. Let's bring in National Affairs Editor for the Daily Telegraph, Sky News host James Morrow, and Senior Political Reporter out of Canberra, Trudy McIntosh. Well, welcome to you both. I mean, this court case, I almost feel sorry for a bad government. I shouldn't because they're incompetent, but I almost feel sorry for them because there's not a week that goes by there's not some sort of stuff up in this comedy of errors. We know all the past history about these detainees. One only required to be released from the High Court. They let 149 out. James, we've got Claire O'Neill, the Home Affairs Minister. So she's in Cabinet. Giles is not in Cabinet. He's the Immigration Minister, so he sits outside for people at home, but he's still in the ministry. The senior minister's come out today to say, don't worry, there's all these strict visa conditions on these people. We've got ankle bracelets, we've got curfews, she says. We'll reapply them to all these former detainees. But, I mean, how can we trust they can do that when they can't even get the paperwork right?
Well, first of all, Peter, I want you to resist your impulse here to feel sorry for these guys. This is a litany of self-inflicted errors, errors that we now know go back all the way to 2013 when the Gillard government was in power. So think about that for a second. But the reason why we cannot trust them on this is because they have been so sneaky and so tricky about this all the way along. You know, the whole thing about we're not going to tell you what they were accused of. We're not going to tell you what they did. It's a matter for the states and territories to reveal that sort of information. The whole time here, they have run absolutely dead on trying to avoid any scrutiny on what has been a bungle they knew was coming for months and months and months. And Andrew Giles was off campaigning for The Voice when he was supposed to be getting briefings from the Australian government solicitor on what was going to happen with this court case. But, you know, that's a matter for him. But now it's a matter for this government. And I really think, you know, he could have survived the last set of blunders. At this stage now, really, he is dragging this government down. I think Anthony Albanese has to act and do something about this guy, no matter what faction he's in.
The Labor spinners today, when they kept saying 2013, they tried to leave the impression this was under the Abbott government. As I said, it was not. Rudd was there too. It wasn't under Rudd, it was under Gillard just before she was deposed. But I tell you what, Trudy, then the line was, well, why didn't Scott Morrison or anyone else do anything about it? Well, the issue there is they didn't let these people out of detention. That's why there wasn't a known issue. You guys did, and then this is blown up in your face. But you've been in the gallery a while. How on earth, every other minister would have lost their job by now. How on earth is Giles still the immigration minister?
Well, I'm still not hearing anything to say that he's not going to be anytime soon, that he's going to be shafted. I also think on that point, does changing the spokesman, and not that he does a lot of press conferences, but just changing the immigration minister, does that really fix the problem here? This is one after the next, these bungles. You can just imagine Andrew Giles getting that phone call on Sunday to find out, oh, we let them all out on the wrong visa. There's been, as you say, I think the spin today was rather tricky. Last night there was misreporting on this saying that it was the Abbott government. Labor seemed pretty happy to let that run. I spoke to a government source this morning who had to admit, oh, look, it was under the former Labor government. It's just a bit too tricky by half. Admit you made a mistake, fix it, and try and move on.
Spot on. What about that appearance? It was incredibly combative last night on the ABC from Ted O'Brien. What did you think of that, James?
Well, you know, I watched that clip there, and I watched it again this morning, and I'll tell you what, this is the weirdest thing I've ever seen. You know, Ted O'Brien is going in there with a good faith interview, and he's just getting absolutely lectured to about nuclear power, why it won't work, with a bunch of talking points that really essentially, I think, come from the left side of Twitter. But there's a real sort of thing that really concerns me about this, and I think you hit on it in your editorial, Peter, is that there's a real timidity around this Australian debate around nuclear. You know, the left side of politics, Albanese, all these guys, their first default idea is, oh, well, we can't do it. We simply can't. Well, you know, sorry, that's not how you build a country, is by saying you can't do these things. There's plenty of evidence that we can. There's also plenty of evidence that the renewables road that we're going down right now is going to deliver ever more unstable power to the grid. It's going to be more expensive. Just look at Snowy Hydro 2.0 and put that, you know, multiply that by however many dozens of projects is going to involve, and you see the economic disaster that we're headed for. Why not at least have the debate, remove the ban, and say, look, let's see where the chips fall on this one?
Trudy, what about this story today? New poll out there. Sentiment has shifted on renewables. It's gone from 70% in August 2022 to 53%. So basically just splitting even with those who do and then those who don't support renewables. You've got the Greens out there today saying if there is a ban on new gas projects, an out-and-out ban, they may well support the government's EV emissions standards, the new rules for cars that are copping so much flack from experts. What are your hearings happening there?
Well, I think Labor wants to do a deal with the coalition on the gas tax issue. That's the PRRT. That's what the industry wants too. Don't forget, the gas sector supports Labor's idea because they just want it done. Just stop quibbling and forcing the Greens to be able to negotiate on these sort of issues. So I think if you're the tacticians in the Labor Senate at the moment, you want to try and do a deal on gas with the coalition. They're still not there when it comes to this EVs policy. We're still at a discussion paper. I reckon there's still quite a way to go on that before we actually see where Bowen lands on something that can actually pass the Senate.
Right, James, this is a tricky one because there has been legal suppression orders in place, but we're finally now able to tell people that the man and woman accused of the kidnap and torture of a Melbourne man has now been named. Involved is allegedly involved, a prominent human rights activist and charity CEO, Laura Allen. She is alleged to have orchestrated the ambush, while Mohammed Sharab is one of the 3 men accused of bundling the victim into a ute and beating him with a hammer. Allen has been highly visible in pro-Palestinian scenes in Melbourne. Do you think there was political pressure to conceal her identity in this case?
Well, you know, it's very tough to speculate about that sort of thing with all the sort of the legal restrictions that are still in play around these allegations, which are incredibly disturbing. But, you know, what I will say is that when you try and talk about this case in a lot of forums, the pro-Palestinian side of the debate, you know, and the left on social media and so on, they are very, very, very wanting to shut this whole story down because it makes them look, you know, by extension, it makes them look terrible, and that this person has been fated by other sorts of high-profile people like Clementine Ford and so on in the past with their social media and things like this. This is a huge black eye, I think, for that movement, and I think that there has definitely been, you know, a lot of social pressure certainly around that. Whether or not political pressure was applied around the judgment, I don't know, but you know, you can definitely feel it out there, the tension on that side of the issue.
Trudy, I'm mused about this week because I don't know who the hell is running the show in the Prime Minister's office on entitlements, or who in the Special Minister of State's office has got an eye on how things are perceived when these expenses are released. We had the Tony Burke stuff, $57,000 for a couple of days in the US. Adam Bant, although who wants to help him, $1 million worth of expenses, 2 private jets, I might add. The PM spending $3 million in his expenses, $2 million on staff travel. I mean, good Lord. But we find out today $22,000 was wasted on cars, booked, drivers sitting there in the white limousines, but nobody bothered to show up, and they never cancelled them, so they're charged back to the taxpayer. I mean, this is outrageous.
Yeah, it's a treasure trove of information, there's quarterly expenses that have come out. So many stories. You can write day after day about the different intricacies of where our taxpayer money is going. I didn't realise the specifics of how the Comcast system works, that if you don't show up, if you don't cancel before an hour's notice, these drivers are sitting there waiting. Of course, they need to get paid for that. You do see, you'll remember this, Peter, there's always cars, these Comcars outside Canberra restaurants waiting and waiting and waiting for pollies to finish their dinner after a sitting night. It's a peculiar use of money. I suppose they've got to get home somehow. But yeah, if you're doing it, shouldn't you be a little more conscious of the cost to the taxpayer?
Well, they say they care about cost of living, but it doesn't look like it. Thank you both. See you next week. James Morrow there, Trudy McIntosh. All right, so some good news in the fight for medical prudence. Britain's National Health Service, the NHS, has banned the use of puberty blockers for children who claim to have gender dysphoria. While fewer than 100 children and teens are currently on blockers in the UK, the number of young people referred to NHS Gender Identity Development Services has ballooned by more than 1,600% in a decade. For more on this landmark decision and what it might mean here in Australia, I'm joined by journalist Bernard Lane, who covers this topic so well for Gender Clinic News. Bernard joins me now. Bernard, take us through this actual decision. What prompted it?
Well, Peter, there's a few elements to it. First of all, an independent expert review of the evidence for puberty blockers, which found that the evidence was very weak and uncertain. We don't know if they're safe. We don't know what effect they have. And also you mentioned the spike in patient numbers and the change in the patient profile. Suddenly a lot of teenage girls, that's the background to it. And so the National Health Service, England, has decided that the puberty blockers should no longer be offered as a routine treatment to young people who are distressed about their gender. Instead, there will be non-invasive psychological and social interventions used now that they're closing down the Tavistock clinic finally on March 31. And through these new regional clinics, which will take over the gender service, they will not be giving puberty blockers as routine treatment.
You talk there about the care of mental health services, psychologists and other things. And I think most people would reasonably say that should be the first order of treatment for young people who have gender dysphoria before anything else, in a medical sense, that sort of course is taken. But we know in Australia, don't we, Bernard, particularly say in Victoria, anyone who might suggest psychological counselling or any sort of mental health treatment for a young person presenting with gender dysphoria is at risk of being taken to court, potentially even locked up for trying to change them out of their mind, even though you just want them to have the best available medical support.
That's right, Peter. And now New South Wales is flirting with one of these badly designed and misleading prohibitions on so-called conversion therapy. I mean, the parallels between the UK with the Tavistock Clinic and the Australian clinics, led by the clinic at the Royal Children's Hospital, are very strong, very direct. The allegation in both cases is that the clinicians get fixated on gender. There is a disposition towards medical interventions and counselling which might help a young person become comfortable with their body, the only body they have, is seen as somehow unethical. It's interesting to note that the Australian clinics are probably more radical in their approach than the Tavistock, which is being closed down. At least at the Tavistock, they admitted that giving puberty blockers to kids early was experimental. There was no good evidence for it. And so they actually ran a study. Whereas in Australia, at the Royal Children's Hospital, for example, they simply introduced early puberty blockers as routine treatment and only later began research.
So, Bernard, if we were doing what Britain's done, we'd have an expert inquiry. We've now knocked back 3 of them, 1 in South Australia, 1 in Victoria and 1 in the federal parliament. If we were doing what Britain is doing and the reasons why they're shutting down this affirmation model at Tavistock, we'd actually be shutting down the unit at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, who also believes in this affirmation model. I mean, am I, drawing a wrong parallel there? Is that a fair comment?
Well, Peter, the medicine that's being given, the puberty blockers, is exactly the same. The weak evidence base is shared internationally. It's exactly the same. So there ought to be difficult questions for our health ministers and our hospitals to answer. If these drugs are no longer safe to be given to young people in England, why are they safe to be given to young people in Australia?
Why can't we have an inquiry? I mean, we've got medicos, we've got psychiatrists and others are coming out, Bernard, who are saying, if you're so sure you're right, let's have a proper inquiry and defend that position. Why are we not even able to have a proper medical expert inquiry?
I think one reason, Peter, is that things are polarised. These medical interventions are presented as progressive, and so any scepticism or wish to inquire into their safety is misrepresented as being right-wing and hateful. The other reason I think that we haven't had an inquiry in Australia is because the health officials are telling politicians that these kids will commit suicide if they don't get these treatments. Now, that is a false claim. It's a very widely used claim by gender clinics. Just recently, we've had the most comprehensive and rigorous study of gender dysphoria transition and suicide, and it found that medical transition, which begins with puberty blockers, did not reduce suicide.
And we'll leave it there. Thank you for keeping us across what's happening around the world on this really important issue. Bernard Lane.
Thank you, Peter.
After the break, both Biden and Trump have clinched their party's nomination. So what happens next as we lead up to November, and will we even see Biden there? Plus that AUKUS agreement looking shaken by the day. News today, of course, that the Pentagon is halving its submarine order. Greg Sheridan after the break. Welcome back. Still to come, more evidence the market is not in fact moving towards renewables, with an 80% slump in investment casting even more doubt over that 2030 target. What does this mean, though, for the millions in government and consumer subsidies if the government refuses to change course? But first, there's certainly plenty going on around the world that could have huge ramifications for Australia. So who better than this next guest to help me break it all down? Foreign editor at The Australian, Greg Sheridan. Well, welcome, Greg.
Thanks, Peter.
I thought I'd circle back now that we've got all but the formal confirmation of the two major nominees, Presidents Biden and President Trump, for the Democrats and Republican parties subsequently. What happens now? We know in the middle of the year we've got these big conventions formally ratifying them as the nominee. There's all this doubt about Biden, that there somehow will be a great big switcheroo, that he will not be there in November. How do you see this playing out from here on in?
So, Peter, I think it's over. Well, it's highly likely it'll be Trump versus Biden. Biden now has the delegates, so you can't blast him out. You've got to convince him that he needs to go. I thought he did do well at the State of the Union the other night, and it's a low bar. But, you know, if it was a horse race, the stewards would be wanting an inquiry. You know, what was that?
Drug affected or something.
Yeah, was there some monkey juice that he took or what? You know, but he might have looked like an old man shouting at the clouds, but he certainly was with vigour.
Yep.
Trump has got tremendous issues running for him. Cost of living, illegal immigration, law and order, crime, great issues. But is Trump disciplined enough to run on the issues and not go crazy? Biden has had a poor presidency, a weak presidency, but he lets the American system run, and he's not Trump. So he's going to argue that Trump is a danger to democracy, and you'd have to say some of Trump's statements on Ukraine and so on are very, very disturbing. So, I mean, I saw the brilliant Catholic magazine, First Things, the editor writing the other day, he couldn't in conscience vote for either of them, but you're going to have to. But I'd say to you, Peter, my bottom line is it's intensely unpredictable from here. And while I think it's likely it'll be Trump versus Biden, either of them could end up being knocked out by health or by the law or by something else.
Do you think they'll prevail upon Biden not to run?
No. Biden is stubborn and, you know, politicians, you know them better than me, Peter, but a lot of them are sort of narcissistic and solipsistic to the nth degree. You know, Trump's line, only I can do it. Biden believes that too, only I can do it. And Biden says, of course, well, look, I already won, you know. However, if he is convinced that he will lose, then he might make a switch. But it's very high risk. Everything is very high risk. All sides here are playing for enormous stakes. But my guess is Biden will, you know, you'll see his nail marks down the desk as they try to drag him away. You know.
Well, look, what worries me, I guess, about the Biden administration is I cannot fathom that bloke is in charge, right? They wind him up, wheel him out. He can barely get through a press conference. He can barely get downstairs. Yes, I agree with you. I think he might have been doped up at the State of the Union. That was a passable effort. At least with Trump, and I'm no great Trump fan, you know he's running his administration. So that's one of the concerns I have is, yes, you might vote for Biden, but you're getting a whole lot of anonymous players in the administration actually running the country.
Well, I'd be much happier if Trump wasn't in charge of his administration. You know, I'd be very happy if Mike Pence and, you know, Mike Pompeo and the guys last time, Jim Mattis and so on, I'd be much happier if they were in charge. Now, Biden's team is nowhere near as, you know, as good, frankly, as Trump's team was at its best. But they're not bad. Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, the Defence Secretary, you know, they're not profiles in courage. They're not Winston Churchill reincarnated, but they're not bad. They're the familiar American professionals. And in a sense, I agree with what you said, Peter. That is the argument against Biden. But in a bizarre way, that's also the argument in favour of Biden. The American system simply operates kind of on autopilot. You'd want something better, of course, but, you know, depending, are we going to get the good Trump or the bad Trump? The good Trump is very good, the bad Trump is terrible. It's a gamble either way, I think.
What about the Pentagon halving the Virginia-class build? What's the impact here for AUKUS?
This is absolutely disastrous for AUKUS, and this is Biden at his worst. He has increased the overall defence budget by 1%, which means a big cut after inflation. In 2025, he's going to retire 10 ships and buy 6 ships. The AUKUS deal with us, Richard Marles says it's ironclad. He's talking absolute nonsense. He lives in a fantasy world. And the deal says the Americans will only give us subs if it won't compromise their capability. To get anywhere near that, they have to be building 2.33 subs a year. Now, no sub will exist in 2032, which isn't underway and being built in 2025. No new sub. So there's just no way they're going to have subs to spare in 2032. I think it's extremely likely we won't get a Virginia. And if the Albanese government took anything about Australian security seriously at all, they would have a plan B. For example, Peter, the Houthis in Yemen and the Ukrainians have shown us you can sink conventional navies with smart, cheap drones. We make these. Australian companies make these smart drones that the Ukrainians are using. Our Australian Defence Force doesn't have one and doesn't have a plan to acquire one. So we're not going to have a navy. We're not going to have surface ships. We're not going to have submarines. And on top of that, we're not even going to have cheap, effective drones so that at least we could conceivably offer some kind of challenge to a Chinese fleet in our region.
Just a quick one. I mean, I've followed the Pope's comments, Pope Francis' comments on Ukraine. White flag diplomacy sort of stuff. I mean, he is no John Paul II who took on the communists, fought for Poland, stood there with Reagan and Thatcher, is he? I mean, this guy is a great disappointment and influential too. He should be standing up for Ukraine.
Yeah. Francis is terribly perplexing Pope, an extremely perplexing Pope. I mean, I'm a Catholic for what it's worth, and we have to honour the Pope. The Elizabethan martyrs went to their death defending the papacy, even though the popes at the time were crooks and rogues. I'm not suggesting Francis is a crook and a rogue. And the white flag apparently was the phrase of the questioner, but Francis talks rubbish on economics, frankly, it's just rubbish. And
he's dubious on climate.
He's ridiculous on climate. And it's not up to the Catholic Church to work out climate science. They should be, pronouncing principles. But his interventions diplomatically, he's always short of sentiment for the Jewish community and for Israel. He does nothing for Christians persecuted in the Middle East. He's very selective on the things that he speaks out about. He cozies up to Putin. I mean, he's a bit like a Catholic Donald Trump, really. He's all over the shop. And honestly, I wish him a long and happy life, but I think he could really do a tremendous thing by emulating Benedict and thinking that maybe his time there has passed. And it would be good to let a younger man... I mean, one big problem with the Catholic Church, we appoint our popes far too old. John Paul II was so vigorous, partly because he was appointed in his 50s. And so we got 20 years of great papacy out of him.
He's not well, Francis. The Lord works in mysterious ways. You never know what might happen. Thank you, Greg Sheridan.
Thanks, Peter.
All right, after the break, we're going to get into some other issues. Chris Bowen's EV fantasy slammed by experts. We'll get into that. But you won't believe the whopping amount of money Australians are spending on illegal drugs after the break. Well, Kel Richards coming up, of course. It's a Wednesday, but first my panel, Environment Shadow Minister Jonathan Duniam and Senior Fellow at the Menzies Research Centre, Nick Cater. Well, welcome to you both. Nick, we find out today, we know about the 82% renewables by 2030, that target. We find out today, though, that investment is dropping unbelievably. 80% reduction in large-scale renewable project investment. They're still keeping the target on the table. They practically can't get there in engineering terms. And now it looks like in financial terms, they're not going to make it either.
That's right, Peter. I mean, I think that what Chris Bowen forgot in his sort of command economy way of thinking is that you actually need private capital here. And capital, as you know, is a very competitive market for capital around the world. And we've got people running that market who are always looking for somewhere better to invest in. And I think they just don't think right now that renewable energy is a good investment in Australia for obvious reasons. So, you know, at the very time when, under Chris Bowen's plan, we were supposed to be tripling the amount of renewable energy, we've actually found that it's decreased by 80%. They are in real trouble with these targets, and even if they met them, well, they're impossible to meet anyway. Technically, I mean, right now, I just checked on the NEM, we would be needing about 14 gigawatts extra of renewable energy right now at a time when the sun's going down to get close to the target. It can't be done, and it's time they look for a plan B.
Well, they're a loser on these targets, and then they go out and redouble down and put more targets out there in relation to electric vehicles, Jonathan Dunningham. And this is another problem. If they could hit their targets, you might trust them. We know they can't. More experts out today. They're saying that half the utes sold would have to be electric in order to meet the emission standards. And new investigations also found that EVs have up to a third less battery life than we were previously told. Local councils, well, they're trying to get in on the act, that they want to tax large utes and SUVs in a move that the motoring journalist Paul Marrick has said it's ridiculous. He says it's a woke utopia where no one drives anywhere, everyone's on a bicycle or running around in a tiny electric vehicle if this sort of nonsense goes ahead.
It is nonsense. Well, putting aside the merit or otherwise of the goal that's set down here, it is unachievable. And then by putting a tax on these vehicles, trying to incentivise take-up of these EVs is not going to work at all either. And just on local councils, I mean, if they could get the basics right, you know, fixing roads, collecting rubbish and dealing with our rates appropriately, then I'd give them a free pass to go and dabble in state, federal and sometimes international politics. But I think they should just stick to their knitting. On EVs, though, something of interest to me, the Albanese Labor government have of course, converted the entire Comcar fleet to electric vehicles. And I've been reading a bit about Comcar travel lately, and some of these long trips are going to be very hard to sustain for Comcar, particularly their EVs. I don't know how they're going to do it, but it is a ridiculous goal and one I think they have to back down on.
And if it's not all of that, Nick, there's also security concerns about these EVs, because all you need is a chip in the car from a Chinese manufacturer. You'll know where everybody's driving in Australia. You know all the issues that people are having moving around the country. What if there's a chip in a government car? I mean, a lot of those government cars now going to EV. I think they're German EVs, but soon they'll be Chinese. This is also a problem.
It is a real concern, Peter. I've been concerned about this for some time. The Chinese share of the electric vehicle market is growing exponentially. They are now worldwide by far the biggest exporters of electric vehicles. I mean, forget your Teslas. You know, the Chinese are taking that market. They're doing them cheaper than anybody else, and they can do that because we've let them have the whole supply chain, and we dig up our lithium from Kalgoorlie or wherever straight on the boat to China. They process it, they do the battery technology. I don't know that really this was thought through for 1 second when they started to push ahead with electric vehicles. Nobody really thought, well, where those vehicles are going to come from. They're going to come more and more from China. And if Chris Bowen thinks that's a good idea right now, then he really needs to take a break from politics and think about things.
Jono, we talked last week about this nature positive plan, which is Labor's new radical reform of our national environmental laws. There's a whole lot of consultation going on, we're told. But what's this story that phones and laptops apparently are banned from any meeting about the legislation?
Well, can I tell you, Peter, when my kids go and hide in the pantry to sneak chocolate chip cookies, they're hiding something, they're doing something bad and in secret to try and get away with it. Sadly, the federal government is doing exactly the same thing. They are trying to keep Australians out of understanding what it is they are planning to do with environmental approval laws at a federal level. And you used the right word. Radical is what I'm concerned will be the outcome here. What is it they're hiding? Why are they scared of scrutiny? We've been standing here as an opposition offering bipartisanship to get these laws right, because the alternative pathway for the government is to do a deal with the Greens. You do not want the Greens anywhere near environmental approval laws at a federal, state or any other level for that matter. But the fact is they've kept it secret. They won't let anyone take their computers, phones, laptops, iPads into these briefings, and everyone is left in the dark on this. I think it does spell disaster for these laws when they are finally brought to Parliament. We're already about 6 months late. I do not have high hopes for what the government bring forward. We'll be announcing our own policies, given the government have left us in the dark too. But this is bad news all round for Australia.
Nick, just quickly before we go, 4-year terms. I mean, I don't think we should ever go 5 years like the UK, but I am sympathetic to the Prime Minister's view that 3 at a national level is just too short. It's expensive for voters, of course, but to do it, we'd have to get it up in a referendum. What do you think about it?
Well, I'm in two minds about this. Obviously, if you had governments that actually did policy properly and planned and thought ahead, sure, give them 4-year terms. But I think the way our governments have been going in recent 15 years or so, really since Rudd got in, I just think the voters should get the chance to judge them as often as they can. So I think let's stick with 3-year terms right now until we get a government, hopefully the next Peter Dutton government, that can prove itself worthy of being trusted, that they can do something useful in 4 terms.
Well, Senator Dunham, you get 6-year terms, but what do you think for the House? Should it be 3, 4?
Oh, look, I tend to think what Nick said is absolutely right. You know, we should be, no matter what term length there is, doing more to get the job right, planning, actually following through on promises that are made and legislating in a structured way that enables us to deliver on those promises within a term. It's not too hard. We have 4-year terms in many state parliaments, but look, you know, let's get the job right before we tinker with the system.
I think you've convinced me to change my mind. Gentlemen, thank you very much. After the break, Kel Richards, of course. Good words this week. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Let's bring him in. Kel Richards, who joins me every Wednesday. We're talking a lot about nuclear power, Kel, but I tell you what, if I hear nuclear one more time, I thought we need to put it on the show to remind people how wrong that is.
And the man who gets it wrong and who got it wrong in his whole interview with Andrew Clennell is the Minister, Chris Bowen. He keeps saying nuclear. Now, I know he watches the program, so I just want to address this to Chris, rather than you, Peter, if you don't mind. Chris, I know you're watching. Now, just follow me here. It's 3 syllables and they're really easy to say. Nuclear. That's it. Have a go at that, Chris. Nuclear. If you try, you can do it, because we can't take you seriously about criticising this form of energy if you can't say it. Nuclear. I think he's getting it.
Spot on. Now, Stephen, one of our viewers, wants to know, this is in and around the whole Sam Kerr debate, and the term we kept using then was a racist remark. And he says, what does a racist remark even mean?
Well, we need to understand it means any abusive remark that makes any reference to any race. To say it means anything else is just to undermine the integrity of the English language. Any abusive remark that makes any reference to any race. Even the Human Rights Commission, for all of its faults, it says race is what it calls a protected characteristic. Not some races, not those races are in and those are not. All race is a protected characteristic. And so any pretense that it's okay, as the hard left does, to attack 2 races, we can attack the white Anglo-Celtic race and the Jewish race, but everyone else, no. Every race is a protected characteristic. If you make an abusive remark that makes any reference to race, it is a racist remark. That linguistics requires that.
Elaine is right to remind us, you know, we often throw around nomenclature all the time. We assume everyone knows what it means, or they at least think they know what it means, and we think we know what we mean. But we've got to drill down into some of these expressions. Identity politics, we use it all the time. Where does it come from and what's it sort of been in its essence?
Listen, for Eileen, I worked on this for a while, and what I think I've come up with to make it really clear to Eileen, which is what she wants, a one-word definition of identity politics. And the one word is tribalism. What identity politics is saying is tribalism. It's saying there's two things that don't matter. Our common humanity, common citizenship, that doesn't matter. Our individualism doesn't matter. The only thing that matters when you evaluate people or when you deal with people is the tribe they belong to. Tribalism. So in the end, it's divisive. But if we think in terms of tribalism, then we're into the mindset which is behind identity politics. And Eileen, I hope that makes it clearer and simpler.
That might have been my mistake. Her name is Elaine, or Elaine, depending on where you're from. But
sorry.
That is a good explanation, Kel. No. I always want to get names right. I get every other version of my definition, my pronunciation too. All right, I'll leave it there. See you next week, Kel. That's it for me. Tomorrow night, Steve Price is sitting in the chair, but I'll be back on Monday at 6. Here's Andrew.